Hey guys, so this is going to be the first lesson on GDP. We're going to go run over the objectives, which is number one, we're going to run over the definition of GDP, and number two, how to actually calculate GDP. So first of all, we'll go to the definition. So the first thing to note about GDP, it's the total monetary value of all goods and services conducted within a nation over a given time frame. And this time frame is normally a year. That's just a basic standard that all economists use when we're talking about GDP. So we can think of the GDP as basically how good is a nation at producing goods. So what does it do within its boundaries, and how good is it at producing goods? So the higher the GDP, the more the country produces within its boundaries. Okay, so that's our basic working definition of GDP. So what are some methods on how to calculate it? So the first method we're going to go over is the expenditure method. The way we sort of think of this is it's the total money spent on all the items produced. Now, under the definitions, there's actually 5 ways we can spend money. According to economists, and they come under different classifications of spending. So first of all, we have household spending. So household. Now, household spending is, we can think of that as the money spent by you and I. So this is money spent by the consumer. So we can buy things like anything from clothes to coffee mugs or computers. That's household spending, and we call that H. The next type of spending, we have investment. And the important thing to note here is it's not investment as in investing in banks or anything like that. Investment is actually defined as money spent by firms on items that are used to produce other goods. So this can be factory items that are used to produce anything else. And we give that the label I. So that's all the money spent by firms. Then the next type of spending we have is government. So government spending. And this type of spending is just anything that the government spends on that we use within the year, which is basically anything that we use for healthcare or defense or anything that the government spends money on basically to produce some consumable item. We give that the symbol G. Now the next two are sort of tied together. I'm just going to label them as net exports. And so the net exports is the total amount of goods that we export. So we're going to start with exports, which are produced within the country and sold overseas. We're going to minus the imports. Okay, so now the definition of the expenditure approach for GDP is we just basically add up all these items. So GDP is going to be the household spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus exports minus imports. Because imports aren't produced within our economy, they're produced somewhere else, so we can't list them under our GDP as we didn't make them here. But exports we did, but they're just sold elsewhere, but the money's still coming back into the country. Okay, so that's a basic idea of the expenditure method. All we have to do is just add up all the things that we actually spent money on. Okay, the next type we use is the income method. And this is basically the exact opposite of the expenditure method in that we just add up all the money received from all the goods made. So the income method is just, in this course we can just think of it as there's 2 ways that we receive money, and that's from profit. So that's the basic working profit of the firm, and we also receive money into the economy from the wages. Oh, sorry. So that's wages. And that's going to see us through this particular course of study. So we're going to say the GDP of just from the income method is going to be equal to the profit of a firm plus the wages that it makes and gives to the people that make the items. This doesn't include, normally the income method would include things like interest, but that's not really going to come up in this course, so we're just going to say GDP from income equals profit plus wages. Now the last type we won't really be able to see too well without going over an example, but the general idea of it is the value added method is the value added at each stage of production. And normally there's a few stages of production and which we need to know the difference between a final good. So we have final goods and intermediate goods. So the idea behind these two is a final good is something that is consumed. So that's the last stage of production, and if we use an example of bread, our final good is going to be bread. But an intermediate good is something that's used in the production of final goods. So intermediate goods lead to final goods. So an intermediate good for a bread example would be something like flour. And during each stage of production, so there's someone producing flour, there's going to be value added to the economy, and then that leads to the next stage into the final goods, so there's going to be some other value added to the economy. Then we just sum the total value from these two, and that's going to be our last GDP. And that's a value added method. But we're not really going to be able to see this until we go over an example in more detail.